Welcome to a deep dive into Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. But today we're looking at a very special copy,
Oh, very
a
special.
really unique one. It's an 1831 edition from the Internet Archive,
Wow.
almost 200 years old,
Yeah,
and digitized for us to explore, which is amazing in itself.
absolutely.
But here's the thing.
Okay.
The archive page mentions some really fascinating details about this specific edition.
Like what?
Well, for starters, there are missing pages right at the beginning of the book.
Oh, that's curious.
Then there are hints that there were actually earlier versions of the story.
Huh. Interesting.
And get this, there's even a depiction of the creature.
A visual.
Yeah, a visual, an actual portrait in the book.
Yeah.
Which is super rare for books published back then.
Definitely rare.
So the big question for us today is this. What can this unique edition, with all its little quirks, tell us about Frankenstein and its impact over time?
That's a fantastic question. It's fascinating because the 1831 edition is really considered the influential version of Frankenstein.
Right, the one everyone knows.
Exactly. It's the one most people are familiar with. And what's really interesting is it was actually the third version.
The third.
Yeah, there were two earlier ones.
Wow, okay.
But what makes this particular edition so intriguing is that it was published during Mary Shelley's lifetime.
Oh, I see.
So it makes you wonder if she had any influence over how the creature was portrayed in that illustration.
So there's an actual portrait of the creature in this edition. I always thought the whole point was to leave the creature's appearance up to the reader's imagination.
That's a common assumption. A lot of people think that while the text itself doesn't give specific details about the creature's appearance, this 1831 edition does have an illustration right on the inside cover. And that's particularly interesting because it's likely very different from the popular image of Boris Karloff that we often associate with Frankenstein's monster today.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too.
Yeah.
It's interesting how those different visuals could impact our understanding of the story.
It's a crucial point. The way we visualize a character, especially someone as iconic as Frankenstein's monster, really influences our emotional response to the story. For sure. It shapes our understanding of good and evil, beauty and ugliness, even the nature of humanity itself.
Right, right. It's like the image becomes part of the story itself.
Exactly. We'll definitely come back to those visual interpretations a bit later, but first, let's talk about those missing pages at the beginning of this edition.
Okay, let's unravel that mystery.
Right. The archive notes that pages I-8 are missing from the physical book, so obviously they're not part of the digital version either.
Missing pages. That's so intriguing. What could have been on those pages? Do you have any theories?
Well, we can definitely speculate. The first few pages of a book typically contain things like the title page.
Right.
Maybe a dedication, a preface, maybe even a table of contents.
I see.
Now, those might seem like pretty standard elements.
Yeah, you don't really think about them too much.
Exactly. But they can actually offer valuable insights into the context of a book and the author's intentions.
Oh. That's interesting. It's like getting a peek behind the curtain of the story.
Exactly. A preface, for example, often reveals the author's inspirations for writing the book and the message they hope to convey.
Right.
A dedication could point to important personal connections that might have influenced the work.
I see what you mean.
In a way, these missing pages are like missing puzzle pieces. Without them, our picture of this edition of Frankenstein feels incomplete.
You're right. It makes you wonder how much richer our understanding of the story would be if we had those pieces.
Absolutely.
And speaking of a more complete picture, you mentioned earlier that there were earlier versions of Frankenstein.
Yes.
I have to admit, that's a surprise to me. I always thought this 1831 edition was the definitive one.
Well, remember, this was actually the third version.
Well, yeah, right.
So Frankenstein didn't just magically appear fully formed, it evolved over time.
I never thought of it that way.
Mary Shelley revisited and revised her work, which means there were probably significant changes between those editions.
That's really interesting to think about. Comparing those different versions could be very enlightening.
Exactly. It could reveal a lot about the creative process.
I'm curious about what kind of changes we're talking about here. Why do you think she made them, and what does that tell us about Mary Shelley as a writer?
These are all excellent questions, and they highlight why exploring different editions of a text can be so enriching. By examining those changes, we gain a deeper understanding of the story itself and the author's evolving thoughts and intentions.
Yeah, it's like we're peeking into her creative journey.
Precisely. And that brings us back to another fascinating aspect of this 1831 edition, the inclusion of the creature's portrait. You mentioned earlier that you always imagined the creature based on your own interpretation of the text, right?
Yeah, it did.
Well, now we have this illustration, which, as we discuss, is probably very different from the image we have in our minds, thanks to Boris Karloff.
Right. And that makes me wonder how this illustration created so close to Mary Shelley's own time might challenge our preconceived notions about Frankenstein's monster.
That's where things get really interesting, because how we picture the creature can deeply affect how we feel about him.
Right.
We might even end up questioning who the real monster is.
Wow. That's quite a thought. It seems like we've only just scratched the surface here.
Hmm.
What are some key things we should keep in mind as we continue this deep dive into Frankenstein? What should we be paying attention to?
There are a few key things to consider.
Okay.
First, those missing pages. They represent a real gap in our understanding of this edition.
Right.
It forces us to fill in the blanks ourselves to a certain extent.
I see.
Second, the existence of earlier versions reminds us that Frankenstein was a work in progress.
It makes sense.
It reflects Mary Shelley's own evolution as a writer.
Okay.
And finally, that creature portrait, which is likely quite different from the image we're used to, it has the potential to completely reshape our perspective on the story.
Okay, I'm ready to dive deeper. Where do we go from here? What's next in our exploration of this fascinating edition of Frankenstein?
Let's delve into those earlier versions. By comparing them to the 1831 edition, we can trace how the story evolved and what that reveals about Mary Shelley's creative process.
That sounds great. Let's unpack those earlier versions and see what secrets they hold.
Let's do it. So we're diving into those earlier versions of Frankenstein to see what they reveal about how the story evolved.
Right. I'm really curious to see how the story changed over time and what that might tell us about Mary Shelley's writing process. It's like getting a behind-the-scenes look at how she created this masterpiece.
I like that analogy. And it's a good reminder that Frankenstein wasn't just a one-time creation. It went through these different editions and revisions.
Mhm.
In fact, the very first version of Frankenstein was significantly shorter than the 1831 edition we're exploring.
So really, sure,
Yeah.
how much shorter are we talking? What kind of changes did she make between those early drafts and the final version?
The first draft, which Mary Shelley completed in 1817, was more of a novella than a full-fledged novel. And it actually lacked some pretty key elements that we see in the 1831 edition.
Like what?
Well, for example, the whole frame story with Captain Walton was missing.
Wait a minute, the entire Arctic expedition that frames the story of Victor Frankenstein wasn't in the original version?
Nope. It was added later.
That's a huge change. Why do you think Mary Shelley decided to add that whole section later on?
That's a great question, and it leads to some interesting theories. One idea is that she added the frame story to give a broader context for Victor Frankenstein's tale.
I can see that.
It emphasizes the dangers of unchecked ambition and the pursuit of knowledge at all costs.
Yeah, it creates that cautionary tale element with Walton potentially heading down the same path as Frankenstein.
Right, exactly.
Hmm.
Are there any other major differences between the versions?
You mentioned some other significant changes.
Oh, yeah. Another big change involves Elizabeth Lavenza.
Oh, Elizabeth Frankenstein's love interest.
Yeah, in the first draft, she was Victor's cousin. But in the later editions, Mary Shelley made her his adopted sister.
Wow, that's a pretty significant change. Why do you think she did that?
It definitely adds a layer of moral complexity to the relationship, and it might reflect the changing social norms of the time.
It makes you realize that even small changes like that can have a big impact on how we interpret the story.
Absolutely. It really highlights how authors can shape and reshape their narratives through revisions. In the case of Frankenstein, these revisions give us a glimpse into Mary Shelley's evolving thoughts on things like scientific responsibility, the nature of good and evil, and the impact of isolation.
It's fascinating to see how she's refining her ideas with each version, making the story richer and more thought-provoking.
Exactly. And as we discussed earlier, having those missing pages from the 1831 edition adds another layer of mystery to our understanding of how the story evolved.
Yeah, it's true.
Just imagine if those pages contained a preface where Mary Shelley actually explained why she made the changes between versions.
Oh, wow. That would be incredible. It would be like having a direct window into her thoughts as she was writing.
Right. It's amazing to think about the insights those missing pages might have held. It's like a constant reminder that even with all these historical texts available, there are always going to be gaps in our knowledge.
And we as readers fill in those gaps with our own interpretations.
Exactly. And that leads us back to something we talked about earlier, the inclusion of the creature's portrait in this 1831 edition. You mentioned before that you'd always pictured the creature based on your own reading of the text.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, now we have this visual representation from a time period much closer to Mary Shelley's own.
And we talked about how this portrait might be drastically different from the iconic Boris Karloff image.
Exactly. And think about the impact those different visuals can have. I mean, the Karloff version with his exaggerated features and that monstrous look, it's become so ingrained in our culture as the image of Frankenstein's monster.
It really has.
But that 1831 portrait might offer a completely different perspective.
It makes you wonder if that earlier portrait might present the creature in a more humanized way.
It's definitely possible. Maybe it emphasizes the tragedy of his creation and his longing for connection.
That would be a very different interpretation for sure.
Imagine if that 1831 portrait actually evoked empathy instead of fear. It would really force us to reconsider the idea of who the real monster is in this story.
That's a powerful idea. It really challenges our preconceived notions.
Exactly. And that's one of the most fascinating aspects of exploring different interpretations of Frankenstein. It encourages us to think critically, question our assumptions, and consider things from multiple perspectives.
This conversation has really opened my eyes to just how multifaceted Frankenstein really is. It's so much more than just a horror story.
Oh, absolutely. It's a complex exploration of scientific responsibility, the nature of good and evil, and the search for identity and belonging. And by examining these themes through the lens of different editions, we can really appreciate the depth of Mary Shelley's work.
I'm really glad we're taking this deep dive into this 1831 edition with its missing pages, earlier versions, and that thought-provoking creature portrait. It feels like we're piecing together a puzzle with each element, adding a new layer of understanding to the story and its impact.
It is a bit like a puzzle, isn't it?
It is. What are your thoughts on how these insights can help us understand Frankenstein as a whole?
Well, it goes back to why exploring these different editions and interpretations is so valuable. By looking at how the story changed over time, we get a much richer understanding of Mary Shelley's intentions and the world she was writing in. We see how her thoughts about science, morality, and human nature developed.
So it's not just about reading the story, but understanding the story behind the story.
Exactly. The context, the revisions, the different perspectives, they all enhance our appreciation of Frankenstein as a literary masterpiece.
I couldn't agree more. As we continue our exploration of this 1831 edition, what should we keep in mind?
Just remember those key insights. Think about how the missing pages, the earlier versions, and that creature portrait all contribute to a more complex understanding of Frankenstein. It's a story that still resonates today because it grapples with these fundamental questions about what it means to be human.
This has been a really enlightening conversation so far. It's amazing how much there is to learn even from stories we think we already know.
That's the magic of literature, right? It invites us to keep exploring, to keep questioning, to keep discovering new layers of meaning.
I'm excited to continue our journey. What other aspects of this 1831 edition should we focus on as we delve deeper into Frankenstein? I'm really amazed by how much we've learned already just by looking at these specific parts of this 1831 edition.
It is pretty remarkable.
It makes you wonder what other secrets might be hiding in the text itself.
Right, like what else can we uncover?
As we keep going with Frankenstein, what should we be paying attention to?
Well, it's all about looking deeper, going beyond the surface. For example, we should really pay attention to the language Mary Shelley uses to describe the creature.
Okay, how so?
Well, does she use consistently monstrous imagery, or are there moments where her language evokes a sense of sympathy for him?
Oh, that's interesting.
Ooh.
Or even a sense of his humanity.
Exactly. The language itself can reveal so much about how we're supposed to view the creature.
I see what you mean.
Hmm?
Are there any specific passages or themes you think would be especially revealing?
Absolutely. One key passage to focus on is the creature's own account of his creation and abandonment.
Right, when he tells his own story.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We get to hear his perspective firsthand, his feelings of isolation and rejection. And that allows us to connect with him on a much deeper level.
It's true, you start to understand his motivations a bit more.
Right, and it might even challenge our assumptions about who the true monster is.
It's easy to just label the creature as a monster based on his appearance and what he does. But when you hear his side of the story,
Yeah,
it's hard not to feel some sympathy for him.
absolutely. And that complexity, that blurring of the lines between monster and human, that's what makes Frankenstein so powerful and timeless. It forces us to confront our own biases and prejudices.
It challenges us to look beyond just appearances.
Exactly. And to consider the experiences that shape who a person is.
It all connects back to those earlier versions of the story and how they evolved right.
It does.
By comparing how Mary Shelley depicted the creature in those early drafts to the final 1831 version, we can really see how her thinking about monstrosity changed over time.
Precisely. And don't forget the historical context. Frankenstein was written during a period of incredible scientific advancements.
Right, a time of great change and maybe uncertainty.
Exactly. People were both excited and terrified by these advancements.
It makes sense that those anxieties would find their way into the story.
Oh, they definitely did. Exploring how those fears about science and technology are reflected in the novel can really deepen our understanding of what Mary Shelley was trying to say.
It's amazing how a story written centuries ago can still resonate so strongly with us today.
I know, it's incredible. We're still grappling with many of the same issues. The limits of science, the ethical implications of our actions. It's all still relevant.
Frankenstein serves as a cautionary tale for us, doesn't it?
I think so. It reminds us that progress without empathy and knowledge, without compassion, can lead to terrible consequences.
It's a powerful message for sure.
It challenges us to think critically about the choices we make.
And how those choices impact the world around us.
Yeah, absolutely.
This deep dive into the 1831 edition has been truly eye-opening for me.
I'm glad to hear that.
It's not only giving me a deeper understanding of Frankenstein, but it's also made me want to explore other classic books with this same kind of close attention.
That's wonderful. I definitely encourage that. Every text, every piece of history has so much to offer.
It's all about uncovering those layers of meaning.
Exactly. And the joy of discovery, the thrill of finding those connections, it makes the whole journey so rewarding.
So as we wrap up our exploration of this incredible 1831 edition, I want to leave you with a final thought.
Okay, I'm listening.
Imagine you have the chance to hold this book in your hands,
Wow.
to feel its history. What would you look for first? Would you try to read those faded words on the missing pages? Would you search for little notes in the margins, for clues about Mary Shelley's thoughts as she wrote? Or would you be drawn to that portrait of the creature, wanting to see how it compares to the image in your mind?
You know what? I think it's amazing that there are so many different ways to approach this text, and each one offers a chance for new discoveries. The important thing is to stay curious and open to what you might find.
I think that's a perfect note to end on. This deep dive has reminded us that there's always more to learn, more to explore, and more to appreciate in the stories that have shaped our world. So to all our listeners out there, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep. You never know what incredible things you might discover.